A warm welcome to all of you who have tuned in for Transatlantic Trends 2020. I'm Karen Donfried with GMF, and I am excited to be sharing with all of you the results of this survey of public opinion in France, Germany, and the United States. Some of you will remember that GMF, for about a decade, did a public opinion survey called Transatlantic Trends. A few years ago, we decided that survey needed a refresh, and we put a pause on it. And I'm just delighted that my colleague, Alexander de Hoop-Scheffer, picked up the baton and has created a new survey thanks to the wonderful partnership also of Institut Montaigne and the Bertelsmann Foundation. We're excited for this partnership, not only because of the substantive expertise these institutions bring, but also because it means the transatlantic project of Transatlantic Trends is continuing. So a very big thank you to my colleagues, Nicolas at Institut Montaigne, to Irene at Bertelsmann for this partnership. And we're excited to get to the results. So with no further ado, I want to pass the baton to my partner, Nicolas. Nicolas, over to you.
Thank you very much, Karen. Thank you all. In the name of Institut Montaigne and our president, Henri de Castres, I'm very happy to welcome you also, and very happy about this opportunity we had to work in a transatlantic way on these transatlantic issues with the GMF and with Bertelsmann Foundation. We saw this opportunity to participate to this transatlantic trends, and we were not aware that there were another opportunity that we did not foresee at the time when we started working together, which was that we would be in the middle of a huge crisis that would be a game changer for the transatlantic relationship, and able at the end to compare the situation of our public opinions before and after the crisis. And I think that's that was not foreseen, but that's what gives a special flavor to the work we are presenting to you today. It's at the end of a long process of working together. It's also a start, because when based on the results that we will show you today, the work should start about the public policy proposals to bridge to build bridges between the US and Europe on all the challenges that are seen in the survey on digital, climate, health, defense, and security. It should be a start for working together on a transatlantic platform. So thank you again for this opportunity, and I let my colleague from Bertelsmann to give also a welcome, because it was really a teamwork.
Well, thank you, Karen, and thank you, Nicolas, and I think also in general, thank you to the German Marshall Fund and the Institut Montaigne for this great collaboration. I think it was a truly transatlantic partnership, and I believe it is the first time ever that there was a transatlantic survey which was conducted before and during a pandemic, and let's hope it will be the last one. I also want to thank the respective teams for putting this together. Really amazing work. I think the survey points out that a strong transatlantic relationship can only thrive if there's mutual understanding, and this survey rightfully looks at major global challenges from a transatlantic perspective. Some of these challenges have changed over time, and then there are also new challenges which are now part of the debate. And one of those is the digital technology and how it is impacting our society, politics, and economy on both sides of the Atlantic. And that is one of the issues we at the Bertelsmann Foundation work very closely on. I think a vast majority of the respondents of the survey expressed their concern with the digital issues. And I think that shows us that we should not limit the transatlantic collaboration on digital issues just to analyze the policy viewpoints of the Americans and the Europeans, but that we should take a closer look and create greater understanding on how technology is impacting democracy, our jobs, security, economy, but also social inequality on both sides of the Atlantic. We need to understand how it affects the daily life of our citizens. And I think that is the only way forward and the only way to find a common ground for a shared agenda. So I look forward to the upcoming conversation, and I'll definitely look forward in continuing the discussion with both Institut Montaigne and German Marshall Fund in the future. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, thank you very much. My name is Noah Barkin. Can everyone hear me? I am your host for today. Thank you, Karen. Thank you, Nicola. Thank you, Irene. Welcome, everyone. My name is Noah Barkin. As I said, I'm a journalist turned think tanker. I work at GMF and also the Rhodium Group. And today we're talking about the Transatlantic Trends survey. It was conducted, let me give you a bit of background first. It was conducted by Kantar. It's based on the responses of just over 1,000 respondents in the US, France, and Germany. A first set of results was collected in January, and a second set of results was collected in May after the pandemic had spread across the globe and was dominating headlines. We have three great panelists today with us to discuss different aspects of the survey. And it's my pleasure to introduce them now to you. And after that, I'll give you a little bit of detail on how this is going to run over the next hour. Alexandra de Hoop-Scheffer is the Director of Research for Transatlantic Security and the Director of the Paris office of the German Marshall Fund. She will be talking about the Transatlantic Relations chapter of our survey. We also have Michel Duclos. He is Special Advisor at the Institut Montaigne and a veteran French diplomat who served in a variety of senior posts, including ambassador to Syria. Michel will be discussing results from the International Security and Defense chapter of the Transatlantic Trends Survey. And last but not least, from Washington, we have Brandon Bourne, who is Manager of Transatlantic Relations at the Bertelsmann Foundation. Brandon will be discussing aspects of three chapters from the survey spanning trade, China, and digital trends. So we have a little less than an hour left. Each of our panelists is going to spend about 5 to 7 minutes presenting their findings, also showing everyone some slides from the survey. We'll have a very short discussion after that, and then we'll open up the floor to questions from our audience. I would just tell everyone, if you would like to ask a question, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And without further ado, I'd like to turn it over to Alexandra and ask you, Alexandra, everyone has been watching the way this pandemic has been unfolding across the world, how different governments and different political systems have reacted to it. China is widely seen as having covered up the outbreak in the initial weeks before implementing very tough restrictive measures that brought the pandemic under control. In the US, we've seen what to many people has looked like chaos, President Trump playing down the seriousness of the virus, and more recently, a resurgence of infections in states like Florida, Texas, Arizona, which appear to have loosened up too fast. So Alexandra, can you tell us how this has affected perceptions of China and the United States and their relative influence in global affairs? And what about perceptions of Europe? Have they changed at all?
Thank you very much, Noah, and thank you all for joining us today. As Noah just said, the particularity of this survey is that we've asked the same questions before and after the outbreak of the COVID crisis, I think the goal of this survey is really threefold, and you will see that in every question that we've been asking, and actually in the very interesting and sometimes challenging responses we got from public opinions in France, Germany, and the United States. One is to first better understand how societies perceive global challenges today. Secondly, is to see how societies assess, and sometimes, and you will see that particularly in the security defense chapter, sometimes challenge their government's policies. And this is the interesting part, obviously. And thirdly, it also allows us to think of a positive agenda for transatlantic cooperation and dialogue, instead of focusing on mainly the toxic issues we hear a lot in the press, I would say. So these are the three aims. They're very much policy oriented. And the digital chapter will be, I think, particularly interesting for the private sector people who are listening to us today. So about the state of the transatlantic relationship, we've asked the question which you see on the slide: which actor is currently the most influential in global affairs? And to answer Noah's question, yes, there has been a shift in the context of the COVID-19 crisis. It's just very clear. We will be going from one slide to another, before and after, so you can see the shifts. It's not only about the impact of the COVID-19 crisis. We used to say, that this crisis has increased or accelerated trends. I think this is very much demonstrated by the results before and after. Before the COVID-19, as you can see, there was super majorities in France, in Germany, in the United States, recognizing the United States as the most influential power in global affairs. Americans thought that China and the EU were, nearly tied in the second place, with only 6% considering them the most influential. So it's mainly 85% of Americans seeing their own country as the most influential power. And you see more than 2/3 of French and Germans sharing the same opinion. As you can see as well, this is particularly the case in the German view, a much more multipolar view of the global balance of power, with the EU, China, taking a more important spot on the ranking of global power than in the US, it's obvious, and a little more than in France. Now, if you move to the post-COVID-19 outbreak, what's truly interesting is to see that the points that the United States lost have gone to China. In France, it lost 12 points, in Germany, 8 points, and in the US, 8 points. And the perceived Chinese influence has significantly increased, in France by 15 points, in Germany by 8 points, and in the US by 8 points as well. Now, what's striking to me as a French sitting in Paris is to see that this shift has been particularly strong in France. The shift in terms of perceiving US waning influence, and on the other side, Chinese increasing influence. And that to me is probably linked to the very intense debate we had in the midst of the COVID crisis, in terms of realizing how China was extremely powerful on the international scene, how dependent our country was also in terms of the industries and the mask production, etc. But also the strong debate we had here about the absence of US leadership in that particular crisis. And I think you feel that probably in the results. The third takeaway I take from these trends is that what you see is a confirmation that we perceive the world as more and more as a competition between China and the United States. Because in fact, as you can see on the slide, we included Russia as well. What's really interesting is that Russia barely exists in terms of influence in global affairs. A little 2% in France, a tiny 4% in Germany, and a 3% from the American perspective. So there again, you have a validation of this accelerating a new geopolitics of this competition between the US and China, which is very anchored, I would say, in the mentalities of French, German, and Americans. Now, we've asked a similar question, but in the European context, the second one, which was, which country is the most influential in Europe? And it gets even more interesting, as you will see. Because in fact, with the COVID crisis, what happened is that the perception of Germany as being the leading power in Europe has significantly increased in France, in Germany, and to a lesser extent, but still in the United States. And as you can see, the perception of France as a leading power has been sliding even more compared to the pre-COVID crisis. And that is probably due to the perception that Germany managed the COVID crisis pretty well. In France, only 19% of the French respondents say that France is the most influential in Europe, down to 6 points since January. So these trends are really interesting to analyze. And then you look at the Americans, and as you can see, the pie looks very different if you compare it to the French and the German pies, because Americans majoritarily recognize the UK as the most influential power in Europe, placing Germany and France at a much more, I would say, lesser level of influence. And in fact, in May, as you can see, France is put at the same level of influence, a little 6% as Italy, which is interesting to analyze as well. Now, the last question we asked in that chapter on transatlantic relationship was which issues are most important for transatlantic cooperation. And this also leads us, to think of a positive agenda, especially in the US presidential year, on what issues could we build a positive agenda for transatlantic cooperation? And is there a convergence in terms of the desire of cooperation among French, Germans, and Americans? Now, what's striking to me was that the pandemic changed priorities, as you can see, for Americans more than their German and French partners. In the middle of the COVID crisis, what's striking to see on these slides is that Americans are looking to cooperate with Europeans on health issues, but German and French respondents seems to have to see less incentive to work with Washington on health issues. What's also interesting in the German and French perception is that the pandemic has not distracted them from the need for transatlantic cooperation on climate change. And the climate change component in many of the questions we asked was particularly strong and relevant in the French and German perspective, and in particular in the German perspective. It was even as though the pandemic had reinforced the attention and interest for the climate change issue and getting our act together on these particular issues. So to wrap up and lead to the security and defense issues that Michel Duclos will discuss, yes, there has been an impact that you can clearly analyze through the COVID-19 crisis and the way we perceive power politics globally in Europe, in terms of the topics of priorities for transatlantic cooperation. But probably what's even more interesting, and you will see it's particularly relevant in the security and defense chapter, is to look at the deeper, more structural trends that shape and reshape the transatlantic relationships and our perceptions of what we can do together as transatlantic partners. So there are some ruptures, but there are also some clear continuities, which in many cases are quite reassuring in terms of the enduring willingness to keep the transatlantic ties strong.
Well, thank you, Alexandra. That's really fascinating. I want to turn immediately to Michel Duclos, who, as Alexandra mentioned, is going to touch on security questions. Now, we've all listened to President Donald Trump question for nearly 4 years now whether NATO is really in America's interests. He has sharply criticized partners, especially Germany, for not paying enough. And just this month, it was announced that the US is pulling almost 10,000 troops out of Germany as a sort of punitive measure because Germany isn't paying enough. Michel, you're going to talk about the security aspects of this survey. Is all this NATO bashing, is it affecting public opinion in the US towards NATO and the idea of supporting Europe and European security?
Hello to everybody. Thank you, Noah. And the simple answer to your question is no, of course. It's very striking that a majority of Americans are still supporting a strong involvement of the US in European security, defense and security of Europe. And despite the 3 years of not only NATO bashing, but Europe bashing, I must say. And to me, for people living in Washington or people visiting Washington from time to time, it has always been clear that the political class and the Congress, for instance, were still very much behind the traditional transatlantic link. The interest of this survey is to show that on that, the political elite in the US is aligned to the feeling of the public opinion. And for instance, there is an interesting indication in this survey is that according to those figures, more American people are in favor of the American role than the German public. If you take those figures, 51% of the people in the US are supporting strong involvement of the US in European security versus a bit less in Germany. Now, the second slide is about the public opinions in France and in Germany. And then there is also a bit, if not surprising, at least puzzling lesson, which is that the French apparently would be reluctant to an increase of the involvement of their country in international security issues, when the Germans are more supportive of a bigger involvement, bigger engagement of Germany towards international security issues. Of course, here you have to go a bit more into the details, but you can see if you compare the columns of people who are favoring less involvement, the numbers are less in Germany than less in France than in Germany. And if you compare the column people supporting a greater involvement, you'll see less in France and more in Germany. Now, of course, you have to put that in context. And first, maybe make a distinction between hard security issues, that is to say Sahel in practice, and more, let's say, soft or diplomatic issues, let's say, for instance, Iran. And then it's very striking that on Sahel, the Germans are inclined to support a bigger involvement from Germany, when the French are rather happy with the current situation, which, by the way, is not bad, given the fact that we have suffered already an important death toll and also that huge cost. So basically, the two public opinions are, in fact, more or less on the same line. And my conclusion would be the same on, let's say, soft security issues such as Iran, because there you see the Germans demanding to a huge degree a greater involvement from Germany. 49% of the people we ask in this survey in Germany would suggest a bigger involvement from their government. On the French, it's only 28, but here also, please be careful, be mindful of the context. In France, the average citizen may have the feeling that the president is doing already a great job, and that there is not a shortage of French initiatives on this kind of issue. So the impression in France is that the government is doing the job. In Germany, maybe the impression is that given the bigger weight of Germany on the international arena, it would be time for the German government to be more vocal or more visible on that kind of issue. So, in fact, if you take the figures, there is a contrast between French public opinion and German public opinion. If you take the context, you could, on the contrary, come to the conclusion that there is a convergence in the two public opinions. And that would be my take, in fact.
Well, thank you very much, Michel. We're going to turn to Brandon now in Washington. And Brandon, you have the toughest assignment. You're going to be touching on 3 different chapters of the survey: trade, China, and digital trends. Now, some of these are obviously connected. I'm curious to hear how the pandemic has affected perceptions of China, but first, perhaps you can explain a bit what the survey shows about the state of transatlantic trade relations. Trump has said that Europe is worse than China on trade on a number of occasions. We all know that transatlantic trade negotiations, known as TTIP, fell apart even before Trump came into office. What does sentiment look like now, and has the pandemic changed that at all?
Well, thank you very much, Noah, and thank you for those very thoughtful questions. I believe my presentation will be able to provide answers to just about each one. Now, as you said, these questions cover 3 distinct sections of the publication. And in order to provide some sense of coherency, we have chosen questions that have implications on trade. So if we go to the first question here, this question gauges opinions on how respondents feel about the economic relationship between the European Union and the United States. And for this question, we do have pre and post coronavirus results, as you can see on the left and right side of the screen. So before the pandemic, more Americans and Germans felt that the transatlantic economic relationship was equally balanced. The Germans a bit more than the Americans, as you can see. And a near majority of French respondents found that the relationship benefits the United States more. Now, the results coming from the United States were especially surprising. The results seem to show that years of trade disputes and anti-European rhetoric and economic terms coming from the White House did not have a significant impact on shaping American public opinion. Now, after the introduction of the coronavirus, opinions largely remain the same. In the French and German cases, the results from May are nearly identical to the results that we recorded in January. And again, surprisingly, there was a notable increase in the number of Americans who find that the US actually benefits more than the European Union, not less. And so all this to say, the impacts of the coronavirus crisis on economies, on trade, as well as trade disputes between the transatlantic partners over medical equipment, which were highly publicized before surveying in May, have not significantly impacted views on the transatlantic economic partnership on either side of the Atlantic. Now, in regard to TTIP, this question isn't included in this presentation, but for those of you joining us today, if you go to the publication, you can see this. We did ask a question about how respondents felt about a transatlantic trade agreement. And we did have pre and post coronavirus results. Before and after the pandemic, a clear majority in each country support such a trade deal, which is certainly reassuring. Now, if we can move on to this question on China. Okay, perfect. So the question here is, how do you feel about China's rising influence in global affairs? We heard from Alexandra earlier that respondents in each country believe China's influence is indeed rising on the global stage. And in this question, we asked respondents to characterize that development. Only about a year ago, China was designated a systemic rival to the European Union after 15 years of strategic partnership. Since the start of the Trump administration, there's been a highly publicized ongoing trade war with implications on both sides of the Atlantic between the US and China. And it seems that the conflicts regarding China in the areas of trade and technology are registering with the general public. In the January survey, about half of American, German, and French respondents found China's rising influence to be a negative development. However, at that time in all three countries, there was a generational divide on the issue. Younger respondents were more likely to be open to Chinese influence, while older respondents in all three countries viewed China's rising influence negatively. Now, 4 months later, post-coronavirus, negative views of China's rising influence have increased significantly, as you can imagine, in some cases by double digits. Now a clear majority in all three countries have a negative view of China's ascent. That generational divide that we saw in January has evaporated completely. And interestingly, across the political spectrums in each country, from the far left to the far right, everywhere in between, negative views have also increased. All this to say, before the pandemic, despite divergences among the transatlantic partners in the areas of trade and technology, of course 5G comes to mind, there was a consensus of negative views of China's rising influence within the general public in each country surveyed. And since the COVID-19 outbreak, China's reputation has suffered within the transatlantic community. Now, the last question here is related to the tax rate paid in each country by US technology companies. Now, a large part of respondents in all three countries support increasing taxes on big American tech companies. Of course, you're thinking about Google, Facebook, Amazon, Apple. The tendency is a bit higher in France than in Germany or the United States, but the figures are similar, with a plurality of 38 to 43% in all countries in favor. Now, the French government has taken a more aggressive role in this regard, is really leading the way in Europe by implementing a digital tax last year, which, if implemented, could bring in hundreds of millions of euros in tax revenue, which is becoming more and more important post-coronavirus. The support for increasing taxes on big American tech companies is lowest in the United States, where support for lower taxes, for decreasing taxes, is also highest, and that's at 16%, which is double the German proportion. Now, in the US, there are notable partisan divides. Half of Democrats are in favor of higher taxes compared to just 30% of Republicans. And in any case, support for increasing taxes for US tech companies is high within the transatlantic community, slightly lower in the United States, or mixed, I should say. And this topic, the reason we chose this question is because this topic has had significant impacts on EU-US trade relations in the past, really since July of 2019, when that French law was passed. And it's growing in importance as the US withdrawal from the OECD talks on digital taxation threatens to reignite trade disputes, especially between France and the United States. So moving forward, until really a solution is reached at the international level, this topic will continue to have an impact on trade relations between the EU and the US. Thank you, Noah.
Great, thank you so much, Brandon, very interesting. We are going to open it up for questions shortly. So now is the time to put your questions to the panelists. I would ask everyone who would like to ask a question to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. But first, to give everyone time to think about their questions, I wanted to ask a question of all three of you, Alexandra, Michelle, and Brandon, about the outlook for transatlantic relations. Now, looking at the slides you've presented, despite all these tensions that we've seen over the past years, we've just heard that Americans still believe in NATO. There's alignment on the risks posed by China. Many Germans and Americans see their economic relationship as balanced. And there seems to be a semblance of a consensus on taxing big tech as well. So that sounds to me like a strong basis for rebuilding this relationship if, and this is a big if we get a change of administration in Washington. So I'm curious for a very quick take from all three of you, and I'll start with Alexandra on that. Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the transatlantic relationship being repaired if we do get a new administration in Washington?
I think, I think we need to be realistic, neither pessimistic or optimistic, but look at the state of transatlantic relations as it is and as it has been evolving these last decades. I think there's no return to, no back to normal after 4 years of Trump. And that's mainly due to what you just said, which is about US domestic politics, this increasing polarization, which will make a potential Biden president's willingness to reinstore US leadership on the international scene a complicated job because today in the US, there is a wariness vis-a-vis international engagement. You felt that, where you have Americans more or less following French skepticism in terms of getting truly engaged in international security issues. And you have that depolarization, which paralyzes very much the American president. But beyond that, as I said, these Transatlantic Trends survey allows us to look at the deeper structural trends that are shaping transatlantic relations. And I still see three key points of tensions that will continue and that may be even increase under a Biden administration. Number one, I would definitely put the burden sharing debate. We had a slide and the questions on defense spending, and what you see is that this defense spending issue at a moment when Washington is thinking of rebalancing its military footprint in the world will want their European partners to continue to do more and more in terms of military burden sharing, in particular in the southern neighborhood of Europe. So that's the number one issue. The second issue is China. Let's see what comes out of that US, EU, China dialogue that the Secretary of State of the United States, Mike Pompeo, just accepted. But there's truly a need to foster and strengthen EU-US conversation on China and not have two different strategies. And lastly, I would say is really about the changing focus and strategic priorities on the part of the US side. It's really very much focused on Asia. Before Trump, it was a so-called pivot to Asia under Obama, and this will continue to increase. When you ask today diplomats in Washington, who is your most important strategic ally today, they don't answer it's France, Germany, or Europe. They say it's Japan, because Japan is a key ally in terms of confronting China in the region. So that gives you a sense of how these deeper trends are going to continue to drive US priorities. And so I would basically say, and sum up that way, the strength of the transatlantic relationship will depend much more upon what we Europeans can do more rather than from a total return of US leadership with and in Europe.
Yes, well, I would certainly agree with you, Alexandra, that that will depend not only on the Americans, but also on the Europeans. Michelle, what do you think, sitting in Paris? Alexandra is also sitting in Paris. What do you think about the prospects for a sort of détente in the transatlantic relationship?
I largely agree with Alexandra. That is to say that there are positive ground with the trend in the public opinions on both sides, as we have seen in this survey. In the same time, all of us we probably have to invent something new. For instance, it's clear that the dialogue between Europe and the United States must change the focus towards the EU and less on NATO if we want to address the Chinese challenge or address some of the global issues or cyber and things like that. We have to shift the balance between NATO and the EU. Number two, it's clear that the Europeans have to do more, and not only in terms of military effort, and I would say maybe not primarily in terms of military effort, military spending, but more in terms of geographical focus. And it's true that if we are not able, we Europeans, to be present in the Asia Pacific zone, we will become more and more provincial, and we will attract less and less interest in the US. So it's not only about finding new issues, making more efforts, but also probably changing our geographical map of things.
Thank you, Michel. Brandon, what do you say? We've heard from Michel and Alexandra that there's no going back to the pre-Trump era. What do you say? What are the prospects of improving and repairing this relationship in 2021?
Thank you very much. No, of course, I agree with the comments of Alexandra and Michel. I would say that I'm optimistic overall. I think I'd like to end this section on an optimistic note. I think there are two main takeaways for me. I mean, personally, as an American who cares deeply about transatlantic relations, it's refreshing to know that when Europeans look at this survey, they'll see that the administration is not necessarily representative of the larger American public on several key issues within the transatlantic relationship, as we saw in the results on security issues, on trade, which are arguably the cornerstones of the relationship. So I would say that that's my first major takeaway. It's more of a personal one. And then second, I would just say that the consensus that we see in many key areas, we are indeed at a historic low point in transatlantic relations at the moment. The survey, however, shows that despite 3.5 years of the current administration, which is not exactly a champion of transatlantic relations, there is consensus in many key areas still, and there's public appetite for stronger transatlantic cooperation. So moving forward, I think that consensus, that public appetite for stronger transatlantic relations will act as the foundation for a stronger transatlantic relationship in the future.
Well, thank you very much, Brandon. We have quite a few questions that have come in, and I'm gonna ask. We have a question from Carl Lankowski about climate policy, and I will throw this out there. This may be Alexandra. You talked about climate policy. Perhaps you want to answer this one, but. Carl is asking, what is the room for transatlantic convergence in environment policy in 2021? Now, I recall that pre-COVID, climate change was an area that all three countries thought would be fruitful for transatlantic cooperation. But in the US, we've seen a shift since the pandemic. Climate change is not seen as a top priority anymore. Health issues have become much more important for obvious reasons. But Alexandra, what would you say about the prospects for transatlantic cooperation on climate going forward?
I think the question is the response is pretty clear. I think it depends on who will be the next American president, right? Because I think that if there is one big change that is to foresee and anticipate if there's a Biden administration, for me the number one issue is really climate change and the position that he will take vis-a-vis the initiatives that Obama had initiated, for years ago. So that to me will be a big change, and this will probably, build a common ground between Europeans and Americans to rebuild what we call a positive agenda on climate change. Now, what was really interesting in the survey was the generational divide on the American side. The Americans, the so-called millennials between 18 and 24 years old, were much more willing to place climate change as a priority issue where the US and the EU had to cooperate much more than their elder 55 plus colleagues. So that was an interesting trend. And the other interesting trend, we also asked, political affiliations. The Democrat-leaning American response were much more willing also to place climate change as the most important global challenge and the issue where US and Europeans should cooperate. So there we have to look deeper into the data, but these generational and political divides in the US to me were particularly striking.
Mm. We have a question from Ian Bond, which is perhaps one for you, Michel. Ian asks, looking at data on support for US involvement in European security, in France, almost as many people think the US should be not very involved or not at all involved as think it should be somewhat involved or very involved. So a roughly equal split in France on whether the US should be involved in European security. And Ian's wondering if this is, if you think this is a new phenomenon, perhaps related to COVID or perhaps related to the Trump administration, or whether this is something that the French have always felt.
It's very traditional, of course. And probably 10 years ago, we would have got the same result. And 30 years ago, it would have been a huge majority of French people thinking that the Americans have nothing to do in Europe. So I would not say that this is new. It's not at all a rupture. Maybe, if you allow me a footnote of your last question to Alexandra, I think that if Trump is reelected and if he continues with the same stance on climate change, there would be a real danger to see the Europeans looking at China as the right partner to pursue their objectives on climate change. And that could be potentially dangerous for transatlantic relations.
Mm. Yes, China is such a big issue these days. We do have a question on China, perhaps for Brandon, from Hans Binnendig. He says, the survey seems to indicate that while Europeans view China now as more important, they are uncomfortable with that new reality. Yet, less than 20% are willing to do more to share the US burden in the South China Sea. Where can US and Europe cooperate more on China? Brandon, do you want to hazard a guess on that?
Oh, sure. I mean, now this is a question, it was difficult to show this question in this presentation, but we actually have a second question on China that asks respondents how they feel about their country's approach to China on a wide range of issues, ranging from climate change to trade to cybersecurity. And actually within the survey, when you break down the results, there was a majority opinion in each country in the area of cybersecurity that their country should take a tougher approach to China when it comes to cybersecurity. So it looks like there's consensus there. When you look at that question again, I mean, the views of those who think their country should take a less tough approach, that's around 8 or 9% across each individual item. So there's certainly consensus, there's certainly skepticism you can see within the general public when it comes to China on a wide range of issues. Now, when you look at the results initially, it'll look like the United States actually favors taking a less tough approach. But the thing is, the United States is already taking a pretty tough approach to China when it comes to things like trade, when it comes to things like security in the South China Sea. So there really is consensus there. Now, whether that public consensus is a catalyst for actual cooperation between national governments, again, November is important. You know, public opinion doesn't necessarily translate to policy. So that's what I would say to that question.
Thanks, Brandon. I did notice one of the slides not one of the slides presented today, but in the report showed that very few people actually see transatlantic cooperation on China as important. Now, one can understand that there are other issues, health, terrorism, climate change, but that struck me as interesting. We have a few questions about Russia, which is not seen as an important actor, as a country that wields huge global influence. But if you read the newspapers, Russia is everywhere, right? We have a question from Jérôme Legrand saying, pointing this out and saying, questioning this sort of divergence between the results of this survey and the fact that Russia seems to have its paws in so many different pies. Does anyone want to jump on that?
I can begin. No, it's an interesting question, and the results were quite striking because we would have thought that French, Germans, and Americans would have been a little more people responding that, you know, Russia was perceived as a influential player on the international scene. And that leads me to complement my reply with a question that I've seen was asked: how did you define influence in the survey? Because the question was, you know, how do you perceive the influence of China, the US, and Russia today? Well, we didn't define it because it's a broad concept, but basically, you know, it's about ranking the most powerful countries today on the international scene. And it seems that, I think, especially in the COVID context, seeing how, you know, China very much influenced the narrative, the debates, set the agenda inside the WHO, the UN agencies, that type of influence, which goes beyond the geopolitical, strategic, is a much deeper political influence that China has succeeded to build and increase, in fact, thanks to, you know, the Trump administration in many ways, is, I think, something that people keep in mind, and where Russia probably plays a lesser role. And I think the influence is very much defined by how much do you influence the international agenda, and how much did you influence the way this COVID crisis was managed. And it's true that China very much managed to, you know, keep it under the Chinese narrative, and to influence the way it was handled and debated within these big international organizations. And that, to me, and I'll close it with that, is probably, I would say, Trump's most irreversible legacy. Washington will be able to reestablish partially US leadership within multilateral organizations, but to reverse Chinese influence and increase influence in these multilateral institutions, to me, seems a much more complicated thing to do, and even an impossible one.
I want to ask one of my own questions of you, Alexandra. Americans believe the UK is the most influential country in Europe by a long shot. What is going on there?
No, we laughed. I mean, when we saw the figures, because the contrast was so striking between the French and Germans, who very much were very clear in terms of seeing Germany as the top leader in Europe, and Americans saying majoritarily it's the UK. I think we should explain it by just the strength of these historical cultural ties that tie the United States and the UK together. The fact also that Trump has very much been talking about the Brexit, and the fact that there was a rapprochement in a quite of natural way between the US and the UK now that the UK was freed from the EU institutions. So that probably has influenced the American response. But basically, we explain it by the very, I would say, natural cultural ties that tie the United States and the UK together.
Thank you. We have about 5 minutes left. I have a question that either Michelle or Brandon or both could try to answer. This is perhaps also puzzling, just like the American views on the UK and UK influence. Samuel Motley asked the question, with the focus of the US security concerns shifting towards Asia before and likely after Trump, what are the likely drivers of this strong support for NATO within the US? Does anyone want to, Michelle or Brandon, do you want to talk to that question? Why are Americans so supportive of NATO after 4 years of NATO bashing from the US president?
Brandon, please.
Well, I think it's tough to say. I mean, of course, there's, an organization like NATO has such historical ties between the United States and Europe. So I think that is certainly something to take into consideration. I mean, I was shocked by the numbers in the US case when it comes to Europe. I mean, the support for European security and defense in the European sphere. And when you compare that with what the Trump administration is saying right now, I mean, when you look at the decision to pull out troops of Germany, I mean, that presence in Germany is one that, of course, Russia is a huge concern when it comes to the US presence, or is very important to the US presence in Europe. I think, that 35,000 soldiers that are stationed in Europe, a large proportion of those soldiers are actually deployed further. They're what are considered rotational forces, and they deploy further to eastern parts of Europe to help with NATO members in that, to counterbalance Russian aggression in the region. Also, Germany is incredibly important when it comes to U.S. efforts in the Middle East. Of course, Stuttgart, for example, is the headquarters of the European Command, as well as the African Command as well. Ramstein, of course, is this midway point between American soldiers deploying to Europe and then deploying further to other areas of the world. So I think that could explain it when it comes to why the support for American presence in security and defense topics is key.
Thanks, Brandon. We have a question from Gudrun Wacker at the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, think tank here, leading think tank here in Berlin. And I don't know the answer to this question. Perhaps, Alexandra, you do. Were there any questions on attitudes vis-a-vis international organizations, multilateral versus unilateral approach, specific organizations, WTO, United Nations, etc.?
So they were not specific questions on international organizations, but this could very well fit into a second edition next year. I think it will be extremely interesting to ask the question with a certain dose of understanding of how the COVID crisis would manage or not well managed within these big international organizations. But we basically ask questions more focused on international engagement, especially within the big crisis and the conflicts of today. So basically Afghanistan, Syria, Sahel. We've asked questions also on the Korean Peninsula, on the South China Sea. So all of these more hard power stuff. And there, once again, you find a greater French skepticism rather than the Germans and Americans, who are slightly more open to more engagement. But fully agree that these questions will be or should be incorporated. I think this is, as I said, probably the issue where the retreat of US leadership has left the most space to China to step in, and that to me is going to be very complicated to reverse once again.
Thanks, Alexandra. Unfortunately, we're out of time. This was a really fascinating discussion about a really interesting survey. So I would urge all of you out there who are interested to go to the GMF, Institut Montaigne and Bertelsmann websites, where you can find the results of this survey. I want to thank all our panelists, Alexandra, Michelle, and Brandon. Thank you for joining us today. We're facing, I think, one conclusion that we came to, and it's not a difficult conclusion to reach, is that we face a very pivotal election coming up in November. And this election will have a huge impact on the future of the transatlantic relationship. And I think this campaign is going to start gaining steam over the next few months. So it's going to be certainly one to watch over the coming months. Thank you again to everyone. Have a very nice evening in Europe and a very nice day in the US. And thank you to all of our audience for joining us. We hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Noah.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you.